It's time now for the Morning Magazine, brought to you by the Riverview Hospital in Wisconsin Rapids and Comfort Air Heating, Cooling, Plumbing. Now, with the Morning Magazine, here's Carl Hilke.
Thank you, Jerry, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's show on AM 1320 as well as on the web at WFHR.com. It's a little bit off his normal schedule, but he was out of town during his normal time period, so we promised you he would be here, and he is. Wisconsin Rapids Mayor Zach Vruwink is here for the entire hour, and we're going to be concentrating on two very important issues, revaluation as well as the 2014 budget. But the phone lines are open for any of your concerns or comments to his honor at 424-2600 or pound 1320 on your U.S. cellular phone. With that, we welcome the mayor of Wisconsin Rapids, Zach Vruwink. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Carl.
Okay, so I'm going to allow you to introduce your program.
All right. Well, thanks again for the opportunity, and thanks for being flexible with our month's schedule. So hopefully our listeners did pick up on the schedule change this month. So we've got, as you mentioned, two, I think, really important items that we want to be really forthright with people about and make sure that I'm accessible, but also the other city leaders are accessible. So the first being the property tax revaluation. And so today I'm joined by our city assessor, who can speak, obviously, much deeper on the subject of the revaluation than I can. And then we'll be talking 2014 budget. We may have the finance director joining us later in the show as well. So Steve will be joining us for the first half an hour of the show before we take our first break. So that way we have the opportunity and listeners can call in with questions for Steve, and we'll make sure that Steve's available. His office phone is available for those that don't get their question answered on air.
Okay. Steve Shepro,
yes.
The city assessor, is here. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Carl.
Okay. I got my envelope or my assessment in the mail the other day. I noticed went up a little bit, and I was kind of expecting that. It was no big deal. But let's talk about, first off, what's going on right now. People have been making appointments to have their properties looked at, and then let's just talk about and why it has to be done.
Right. Well, the revaluation is initiated basically from the Department of Revenue. Once the city goes below 90% of valuation, and that's based on sales in the community, we are notified by the state to do a revaluation. We've gone through that process. The properties have been visited and information updated into a new software program. Right now we're in open book process, which gives property owners a chance to come to our office and discuss their assessment if they have any concerns. We can go out and review a property if we feel it's necessary. If we don't have the correct information, we can still do that at this point and still make it changes for the 2013 assessment season. Following this, we have the board of review, which is November 13th. That's where the property also has the right to basically object to their assessment. It's a little bit more formal than it is during open book times. So that's the process right now we're in. So.
And I noticed that when I got my documentation in the mail, it told me about those two things. It's open book time, and it's also you have the right to appeal to the board.
And I think maybe it makes sense to announce to listeners and remind listeners that this was initiated the first time we've done a comprehensive revaluation of this scale since the year 2000. Correct, Steve?
Correct. That's correct. Yep.
That's a long time. Typically, is it every 10 years or every?
Well, it's mandated by the state, basically. Once you go below 90% or above 110%, the sales to assessment values, if the difference is there, the state monitors just like we do on a yearly basis on the average sales out here. And once that is determined that we were below 90%, that's what initiated it. Normally, I would say to keep equity between properties 5 to 7 years is probably beneficial to do at that time. You don't have as much drastic changes, and you make sure you pick up everything that's supposed to be or change things that should be taken off.
I guess that leads to the question for our listeners and our average homeowner. What does this mean for me? Are my taxes going to be going up? Are they going down? That's what I'm sure a lot of people are probably calling you. What does this mean?
There's a lot of elements to it, right, Steve? And I think, the average home, let's take a $100,000 home. So we did some projections based on that. The average rate that we picked up was about 6%. Is that correct?
That's correct, yep.
So on a $100,000 home, if they're previously assessed at $100,000, their assessment today would be $106,000, which is the average, the lion's share of what most people experienced. Obviously, people were above and below that, but the average is about 6%. With the city's tax rate actually declining this next year, the actual rate, because we picked up further valuation, further base to assess. There's other taxing entities, which we always discuss and remind listeners. You've got your state taxing jurisdiction, you've got the county tax, the school district, and the mid-state tax rate, and then your city tax rate. So of those, the school district tax rate is the one that is projected to have an increase, a percent change. So for anybody looking at their tax bill, getting it in December or sometime, they're going to notice an increase on the school district side, but the rest of the entities having a slight decrease. The school district on a percentage basis for $106,000 home is about 27%. Now these numbers have not been the levies have not been set entirely yet, so we don't have the information from the school district yet, but this is projections based on the best available information.
Okay, so I guess that's another thing. I'm glad you brought it out, is to pay attention to your tax bill. People get their tax bill and they just look at that bottom line, and then they call you, and you might not be the reason there was an increase overall.
That's right.
Increase.
Yeah, and so let's take 2013 for example. So our tax, the total net taxes of all of the entities that people get on their city tax bill, for example, was about $28.51, and we're projecting in 2014 a drop to $26.99, and so that one of the first times in a number of years having an actual decrease because we're picking up additional valuation. But the school district having a pretty sizable impact. In this case, from 2013 to 2014, the estimated taxes that they would pay on the $100,000 home towards the school district would be about $947 this coming year. Previously $920, $919. So about a $30 or $27 increase, which is obviously why their tax bill could go up.
Okay. What did you find any surprises as you were going through this revaluation at all?
No, I think it's just basically the inequities between properties that our biggest concern was, and that's from people taking out permits or not taking out permits, and a lot of changes on properties over the years. And by doing a revaluation, we are able to pick up the correct information and assess things fairly for everybody. The other thing that I wanted to follow up with the mayors was the last time we did this was back in 2000, and I believe the increase was 20 to 25% increase in property values at that point. And when I think the biggest question we have is we're very aware of the economy. From 2000 to 2007, we pretty much went up 2 to 3% a year. That's typical for Wisconsin Rapids in home values. In 2007, we started to see the downturn of the economy. And all that's taken into account. That's why our increase was only about 6% and compared to 20 or 25 back then. We went up pretty good years. This last year, we had a 1% increase. It's not the greatest, but it's still in a positive direction. And that's something to look forward to, that we probably going into our next year that we'll be back to the 2 to 3% increase in property value increases. So,
if you're just joining us on the Morning Magazine, welcome. We're getting our monthly update from Wisconsin Rapids Mayor Zach Vruwink. We're also in the studio with City Assessor Steve Shepro. We're talking right now about the 2013 revaluation. We got our first caller on the line, so let's get right to the phones. And good morning, you're on the air. Hello. Okay. Well, apparently we lost contact. Try again. The phone line is open, 424-2600, pound 1320 on your U.S. cellular phone. There we go. Maybe we got him this time. Good morning, you're on the air with the mayor.
Gentlemen, I'm sorry I did something to my phone. We're looking forward to a full hour of great information. Can you tell us, there's dates, of course, with the open book Monday, yesterday that happened, and then today again, Tuesday and Wednesday. And then if we have legitimate concerns, which we don't, but I'm speaking for a friend that really does, what information do they need to gather, and are they given that information at the initial open book visit? And if you could share that over the radio, I'll be listening. And the second question that I have is, now that we have had this 100% look at the city, we then can have some accurate statistics on owner-occupied and rental and out-of-town landlords and in-town landlords. So that can be another statistic that we can grow and live by and have some info on. And I'll listen off the air, and I thank you for a great program, guys.
Okay, thank you for your call.
Sure.
And that is a very good point. If you have, some concerns, what kind of information do you need to bring to the open book or even to the hearing?
Well, I think originally, of course, we do look at appraisals. If they had appraisals from a bank on properties, that's something we can review. But normally most people are just comparing with the neighborhoods. They know what the neighbors have sold for. That's very useful. We will sit down and go through that information. And that's something for open book or anytime they want to talk to the assessor. I mean, this is a reval year, but I am here every year. Assessments are available every year. We discuss them each year, so it doesn't have to be just this year. But for the board of review, it's a little bit more technical. They would want to bring in something like an appraisal or at least comparables that they want to compare to, because the board looks at facts, basically, and they will determine what the assessor's value is and what the property owner feels the value is, and then the board makes the decision on that. They don't look at tax dollars, they look at assessed value. So.
Okay. The caller brought up a thing, too, about getting a handle on owner-occupied rental and also out-of-town rentals. Mm-hmm. And that goes into, dilapidated properties, properties that have been unoccupied and being ignored. And
and I haven't spoke with the assessor about that in terms of how that process may have lended itself to getting a better handle on it. I think Adam's department in planning and zoning dealing with maybe looking at some sort of permitting process, not to approve or deny, but just to quantify, right? To understand how many owner-occupied or rental-occupied properties we have in town. And then taking it a step further, who are your in-town landlords and who are your out-of-town landlords? I don't know, Steve, maybe if he wants to chime in, if there's been any insight through the process of the reevaluation. That process doesn't look at that necessarily, but there may be some information. Steve, was there anything on that you could identify?
Exactly. What we did, we have a new software program that we initiated during the reval here. Now we're totally switched over to a new software program. And in the software, we're able to code properties for 2-family, 3-family, 4-family, multi-family apartments. So we do have that capability. The one we don't have that I've been working with Adam from Economic Development with is trying to do the single families that people purchase them as a single family home, but then they don't live in them, they rent them out. There's really nothing that we can do to track, and the only thing that I spoke with the mayor previously, and I think with Adam in regards to this, would be basically some type of permitting thing for like an occupancy permit or something on that. So we can keep track of it, because I think it is very important, and I think a lot of property owners are very concerned about that. So.
You brought up another point when you were talking about this revaluation process, people who've had work done on their home without getting a permit. Mm-hmm. Is this an area where we need to do a better job of making sure people and contractors get the required permits before work is done?
Well, I think that's a big animal. It's a big undertaking because there's, as you mentioned, there's the contractor doing work without a permit. There's the homeowner not pulling the permit, and then maybe the misunderstanding that the contractor is taking care of the permit or the homeowner is taking care of the permit. I don't know. We haven't really gotten into that too much in terms of what are best practices around municipalities that have had great success with that. You catch it in the form of the reevaluation, and I think maybe Steve can talk about. He works in a couple of other municipalities too. That maybe there's some best practices that they've picked up.
Yeah.
No, I think we actually already took them steps with Adam, and from Economic Development, we have spoke on this a number of times. There's only so much. You don't want to discourage people doing updating and stuff, and a lot of the changes they don't realize really doesn't add a lot of value. It may be worth more to them than it actually is on the market. One of the things we looked at was basement finish. That's always been a nightmare for everybody, I guess, is basically, but they don't realize that a lot of this stuff we lowered down quite a bit this time because it just doesn't have the same value it used to have years ago. People spent more time in the basements. Now they want to be on first floor, sunrooms, more of a situation, and that's where the value's at, not so much in the basement. But we try to keep it, but we have taken the steps to try to improve it a little bit, and I think we have. We have a very good communication between our two departments as far as to make sure that, that if he has a question on something, or if I'm out in the field doing something, we do share information. So.
And I do know, like, a number of contractors are very good about getting the permits, and they'll tell you right up when you sign their contract. And I'm in the process of going through some planning for some work next year. And that's one of the things I'm making sure of is, hey, listen, I expect you to take care of all the permitting stuff. I don't want to deal with
Right.
it.
They're the experts. Right?
They're the
They deal with
experts.
this frequently, and I think we, Adam and I, went to the Central Wisconsin Home Builders Association last year about this time, maybe a little bit later in the year, to talk about this and to talk about economic development, but also talk about why you need to pull permits. And it is for safety and for the well-being of the occupant, for the inspection purposes, but it's also just for us to make sure that the work is being done appropriately. And I think we've had conversations and no action on it yet, but conversations about what thresholds we require permits at. Maybe there's ways for us to streamline the permit. So it isn't necessarily people don't want to pull the permit, but maybe it's cumbersome or redundant, in many cases. So looking at maybe we can package some of those permits so you don't need to have permit for this, for every little
That's
silly
the thing that I think gets people is, okay, I got a permit for this, now I need a permit for this, now I need a permit for this.
Yeah.
Is there a way where...
You've got a $5, $15, $25
right.
charge for all of them.
Is there a way we could package this all into one super permit?
Right, ultimately, yeah. And I think we've had discussions about that, and we haven't, again, really put forth any proposals to the council to consider, but I think there's definitely merits in that respect for more effectiveness in terms of people pulling permits.
Well, I think that if you simplify the process, it's more understandable to people, and when the process is more understandable, you have less chances of something falling through.
That's right. That's right.
Because I think that's sometimes I think it's just, like you said, a misunderstanding. Oh, I thought I had it covered with this permit, but I need it now this one too.
And then they're being fined or charged the double permit fee because they didn't pull a permit in the first place, or maybe it was missed legitimately or not. But it's definitely a candidate for the rapid improvement piece that we've identified it as an area that there's improvement to be had internally around the process that it takes to pulling the permits only at the side of the residents sees. There's so much more that the permit travels within City Hall. So making sure that we're looking at that process to make sure it's done most efficiently and done without too many touches and all that sort of thing.
And you've mentioned you've talked to area contractors and the like. Is that something where they could weigh in and say, hey, Your Honor and members of the council, here's the problem with the roadblocks we see, or where we see some problems. Would that help in this process?
Yeah, and I think it's been ongoing in that respect. One of the pieces we got was contractors, knowing that they're doing a lot more of their work online, they're able to order materials and such online, is that they should be able to pull permits online and upload plans. So that was an improvement that we launched, I believe, in the last maybe year and a half for contractors and such, and residents to be able to pull a permit right directly through online. So be able to submit the permit form and request to City Hall. I believe there's a component that they still need to get their building permit to post and that sort of thing, but making sure that service is available online.
What kind of information, you mentioned where we went up, okay, maybe not as much as in the past, but we're going in the right direction. In turn, what does that mean in terms of your budget planning, your economic development planning, when you get that information?
Well, it's more about capturing more of the base and capturing more of the value. So it doesn't necessarily generate more money for the city. In that respect, it can lower our tax rate, thereby levying less taxes on a particular parcel. So it doesn't necessarily generate any more money for us, and I think that's the misconception that people have sometimes is the revaluation, my assessment went up so the city's getting more money. Well, all things equal, it's just balancing the assessment out across the city, and I'll ask the assessor to chime in anytime if I'm saying misspeaking or anything out of that's really from my perspective. But in terms of budgeting for economic development, now as the caller had referenced, we have a 100% look now. It's a comprehensive look. It was very intensive in the sense that we had people on the ground going property to property, parcel by parcel, all 8,500 parcels, just shy of 8,500, that had some sort of site visit that took place, whether it was internal or just an external view. So I think we have an opportunity now to look at what the valuations of neighborhoods are, and then connect that with many other factors. What's the trend of that neighborhood? Is it declining? Is it because of absentee landlords? So it's maybe the blank
Economic
properties.
factors.
Right, exactly, economic factors. So you can start pairing up enforcement, but then with some options. So one of the proposals that's in the budget for next year is a full-time ordinance control officer. One of the pieces related to that is it's great to try to get a handle on blight and all that sort of thing, but if you don't connect them with the resources to be able to afford it. So maybe it's a homeowner that simply can't afford it, or it's a absentee landlord-owned property. You want to connect them with resources in addition to the enforcement. You can't just enforce it and expect them to make change if they simply can't afford it. It's not going to happen.
Well, that's it. I'm glad you brought that up. If you're in an area where it's had an economic hit, and say you've had a number of families that have lost jobs or lost, and all of a sudden they say, well, you need to fix your roof, you need to do this, and they go, thank you, where's the money?
That's right. Yeah.
So.
And there are resources out there, whether it's through the Redevelopment Commission, Redevelopment Authority, with CAP services. There's some dollars that don't turn very often, but there are resources available. So it's just a matter of connecting homeowners with those resources to afford the improvement.
And maybe that's going to be the next step in terms of revitalizing these areas, is getting that information to the public. Mm-hmm. Here is some help available for you.
Yep, that's exactly it.
Okay.
Yeah, and by having somebody that has deep inner workings of that, we can talk more about that position later in the second half. But yeah, I think there's definitely value in trying to, from the assessment side of things, you want property valuation. You want to capture more of that increase in terms of the community, because it proves to the community that we're heading in the right direction with property values. And one of the ways to do that is just to simply make improvements to homes.
Steve, again, for folks that might just have joined us, give us the dates right now again in terms of the open book and the Board of Review.
Well, we're in open book proceedings right now, so we will be there from 9 until 6 today. It's just come on into our office. If you can't make it in, please give us a call.
Where's your office located at City Hall?
At City Hall. On the second floor. We do have it posted on the first floor and to the elevator upstairs. Everything's posted so you can't get lost. And come into our office. Like I said, if you can't make it, just give us a call. If you need me to come out, I can stop out at the home. I have no problem. I appreciate seeing homes. And then this goes on also till tomorrow on Wednesday until 3 o'clock. And then our Board of Review will be on November 13th, and that starts at 9 o'clock. And it's mandatory for 2 hours, and that's it. In other words, if there is additional cases, it can go on indefinitely, basically. Mm-hmm. But normally it's the 2 hours from 9 to 11. So.
Okay, and I guess we talked about get your comparables together, get the documentation that you need, and
we have that information. You're welcome to stop in. I can print out property information for comparables for you. To use against us even. I don't mind doing that. It's just a matter of looking at similar properties out there, and we would print it out and show you what the similar properties are, what they sold for. That's all open information. So.
Okay.
And I guess the bottom line really results in the average. So if most homeowners went up that 6% or the average, and there's no additional tax levy by any of the taxing jurisdictions, you don't expect their taxes to go up. For those that had a increase above the average 6% or had a decrease in valuation, then both of those items would result in tax increases or tax decreases respectively.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you, Steve, for enlightening us on this issue that can be a little difficult for the average person to understand, and that is the revaluation and the assessment process in the city of Wisconsin Rapids. We're going to take our first break, and then when we come back, it's the 2014 budget, and we're going to learn about something called activity-based budgeting. You're listening to the Morning Magazine on AM 1320, as well as on the web at WFHR.com. As always, it's brought to you by Riverview Medical Center. With you, it's personal and Comfort Air.
Read to a child today and spark a lifetime of ambition.
Once again, here's Carl Hilke.
Thank you, Jerry, and welcome back, everybody, to today's show on AM 1320, as well as on the web at WFHR.com. It's our monthly visit with Wisconsin Rapids Mayor Zach Vruwink, and right now we're going to get into the budget, and we're hoping that Finance Director Tim DeSourcy could join us, but it is budget-making time, and we are going to explore some new things being done as the city tries to find the most efficient way to spend our tax dollars or to save our tax dollars. And with that, Your Honor, we've heard a new term, activity-based budgeting. What is that?
I'm glad you bring it up. It's there was some coverage on it recently. I think one thing I want to go back to real quick is the assessment and the revaluation piece. One of the items we failed to mention was we still have a new page assessment objection out there that was filed with the state of Wisconsin. Maybe a month or two ago. So DuPage had objected to their assessment. Now that's done by the state because they're manufacturing. So we've had some activity with them in the city, with the state and the city, looking at them and comparable mills. So their objection was $25 million in reduction in their assessment. So that's something we do want to pay attention to because if for some reason the state would award everything that they've objected to, it really puts our tax base in a kind of a position of concern. And we weren't the only community where DuPage did this. They've done it with their mill out east, but also with the village of Buren and the city of Stevens Point. So just want to make that point. It's not to cause any alarm, but want to remind people that that is an item that's still out there, which could put us in a kind of a tough position should the state award it entirely. Now we can maybe absorb other pieces of it if it's a smaller award to them, but I want to make sure that that's out there.
Good point. So activity-based
budgeting. We took our first stab at that this last year with a couple of departments. We started with engineering with their street construction, street department in relation to that with the park department, and just to start getting a handle on what it is, the activities that we're providing or performing throughout a given day, a given week, or a given year. And to the average resident, it might seem very simple, but historically we haven't tracked and quantified what it is that these activities are that we're doing. So historically our budgets have been wages and benefits and outlay items, capital improvement items, but we haven't tracked performance and we haven't applied metrics to them really on the baseline to start measuring, and for baseline purposes as well. How are we performing against other municipalities? So the first year of this was kind of our first phase. It isn't pretty necessarily until we get throughout the year and we realize how close our estimations were and department heads' estimations. So the areas that it might make sense, for example, let's take street department. Started looking at monthly brush pickup. What does that program cost residents to perform? And so we've estimated that we provide monthly brush pickup for 7 months out of the year. And so what does that cost? What's the equipment cost and what's the labor cost? And then questioning what's the policy that we're allowing ourselves or the city council has approved. In that case, we found that the policy was approved in the 90s. What the policy that was approved in the 90s, we're doing far more than what the policy allowed for. So there's obviously additional costs that go along with that. And so that's an item that I think is an example of maybe representative of some other items that we had policies, we agreed to a certain activity, and then today's terms, it's gotten much bigger than what it was.
Isn't that one of the constant problems with government is that we adopt a program to address a certain problem, and then through time, it grows.
Yeah,
and
lack
the
of
expense
a review
grows.
process. You don't have a regular review, and you don't have a dashboard, for lack of a better word, to look at these cost drivers. And I think that's where municipal budgets, in our case, we don't have an option of not presenting a balanced budget. And of course, the federal and the state government, they can balance. They can do their own budgeting practices, but for us, we have to balance it, right? And so our revenues have to meet our expenses, and or revenues can exceed expenses. But that's a good problem to have, and oftentimes that's not what we're faced with. But yeah, you're exactly right that oftentimes these things may spiral out of control, and I don't want to say that that's the case necessarily with some of our items, but it allows allows us to better quantify what are the activities that our labor force is performing, and then identify what are the performance opportunities. Can we start measuring performance and then rewarding those that are high performers, incentivizing those that may be in a position where they can improve their performance as well.
And then I would think, too, that you're able to get a good handle on what you need for a workforce to handle these activities. Do you have too much workforce in one area and not enough in another area, or do you have some duplication in workforce?
That's exactly it. And that's a delicate subject oftentimes with the HR committee or with city council members, because there's a perception based on what our previous staffing levels were and how that dictates what staffing levels should be in the future. And case in point, so if we're doing less monthly brush pickup, we require less labor, we require less equipment, and so there's a lower cost. So at that point, does it make sense to backfill positions at a certain staffing level, because that's historically where they were at? And that's a position that I know I find myself in with council members discussing frequently is, yes, staffing levels may have been at a certain level, but priorities were such that dictated a staffing level. Well, today that's a different conversation. You may not have the same priorities that you did when a policy was approved at a certain time in history.
And then your activities are also affected by technology.
That's right.
You maybe 10 years ago didn't have the type of trucks that can pick up a receptacle and dump it and put it down.
Yeah, in the case of garbage collection, right? You see many municipalities, or even just in our own greater Southwood County area, that other towns have approached that, realizing that there's a less labor cost, and so there's a less cost to the taxpayer. And I think that's really what this is all about. Is at the end of the day, are there better, faster, cheaper ways to perform a service? It's not to say that we're going to have instant change and we're going to have instant some sort of labor reductions. That's not the case. But over time, we have to be prepared for these decisions. And with data, the decisions are less based on emotion and perception, and oftentimes a lot of politics and arguments that go along with it, and more about what makes fiscal sense and what's the data drive.
Okay, and then you have Lean Six Sigma, where you're developing processes, just like they have at Riverview Medical Center, to try and serve the consumer more efficiently, to do things more efficiently. That's going to have an effect on the budget long term.
No question. And in the private enterprise, obviously, it's for a better bottom line.
Right.
In government, it's just being able to provide the same amount of services with reduced revenues oftentimes. So if our revenues are stagnated, but yet we're still performing the same service, our labor costs are going up, our equipment costs, our material costs are always going up, are always increasing, that we have to weather those expenses somehow. And one of the ways to do that is just to look internally. What are the steps that require too many touches, which translate into too much time, which obviously everyone knows too much time costs money.
Right.
And so if you start looking at it in that respect, that, gosh, this permitting process, for example, we'll go back to that example. If there are too many touches within that step, then there's too much cost, there's too much waste, there's non-value added pieces within that process. So if you're not adding value to the outcome of the permit, well, then we need to look back and see how we can streamline the process, so you're reducing the touches and reducing waste, whether it's time or subsequently money.
Okay, so let's begin with a basic overview of the budget. And again, if Tim can't make it, we'll give his phone number.
Yes, we will.
But basically, let's talk about the proposed 2014 city budget.
First, I would mention it to callers that the budget has been made available online. I believe it's under the Finance Department's link, which I would go back to plug for
Sure.
Steve's department, for the Assessments Department. He talked about some new software platforms and some other things that are also all available online. So people have questions or want to look at certain parcel data, they can do that via the city website. So while it is difficult to navigate, I will agree, you can find this stuff if you spend some time to locate it.
And you're working on trying to simplify that.
That's one of the items in the 2014 executive budget is to look at that piece and hopefully make a better solution for residents. So the 2014 budget was presented about 2 weeks ago to the Finance Committee, 2-3 weeks ago. They've had a couple of meetings to digest the budget and taking a look at the budget looks different than it did in previous years in terms of the actual format of it. So hopefully it's a little bit easier for people to understand. They can also see activity-based budgeting in there if they go to the area of the Parks Department, for example, we talked about as one of the departments. Oftentimes people say, well, you have so many staff members. What are they doing? Well, activity-based budgeting now will provide that transparency for the resident to understand what it is they're doing. So in the case of the Parks Department, you'll see the activities for Whitterfield, for example, the mowing the ball field, cleaning the ball pits, all that stuff takes time and you need somebody to perform that function. So you'll start to see some of that activity-based budgeting in those departments. So that's available online for those that have interest, and maybe the budget geeks, if there are any out there that like to see numbers. Some of the stuff, is just labor and just cost from that standpoint, but there are other ways for other areas that do provide more detail as we look forward.
Okay, what's the bottom line? What do we look at? What's the total budget, and what does it mean in terms of taxes?
Sure. On the surface, we had $1.1 million reduction in expenses over the previous financial year, and that can be it's from many reasons. One, we don't have a couple of grant programs, the Safe Routes to School, which was a federally funded program that we're performing on Washington Street with the sidewalks. The Roundabout was another funded program within 2013. So while on the surface it looks like we're spending $1.1 million less, well, we are, but it's from the sources of special projects that we've done. So that's on the surface. From a spending standpoint, in a memo I drafted to the HR committee and to council members today, indicated that we should be doing annually, kind of to Steve's point about an annual review of sales for property values, we should be doing the same for our budgeting. And part of it speaks to the Rapid Improvement Initiative, finding better, faster, cheaper ways to perform a function or reduce the waste. But the other side of the equation is when you have retirements or when you have departures from the organization, we need to be taking a look at, okay, what can we do differently now because that position is vacant now. And so we had a number of retirements over the past year, and there was a newspaper article that kind of on a high level talked about a number of proposed hires for next year. And so on the surface, when people could be shocked, gosh, the city's hiring all these new employees. Well, frankly, because of all of the retirements and a little bit of the other shifting that we've done with staffing, we're only creating a half full-time equivalent additional over the previous budget year. So on the surface, again, it looks like, gosh, they're hiring 4 or 5 new people. Well, that's not the case because of the fact that we've had a number of retirements. And so at the end of the day, it's all about reprioritization of resources.
Okay, I'm glad you brought that up. So when we look at that, you have to, that's only one part of the formula. Mm-hmm. You have to look at the other side of that formula, which is retirees,
that's
people
right.
who have left,
yep.
and then the reorganization, and then you come up with an accurate number,
mm-hmm.
which is, you said the bottom line is it's a half of a position.
Right. After, when the dust settles, it's only a half additional full-time equivalent. And I can go through the hires, and I think there's another piece before we go into the hiring piece that we should talk about is some additional expenditures. Go ahead, Carl.
Why don't we take our last break,
Sure.
and then we can get into that, because I want to give you all the time you need to do this. We're looking at the city budget with Wisconsin Rapids Mayor Zach Vruwink. Back with more right after this. Again, cloudy and 34 at AM 1320. Welcome back to the Morning Magazine. We're visiting with Wisconsin Rapids Mayor Zach Vruwink and the 2014 budget. We've just learned, so when you're hearing about, oh boy, the city's hiring all these people, remember to offset, subtract from that number the people who have retired and left. And when it all comes down to it, it's a half a position, okay? So we understand. So, Your Honor, the floor is yours as you continue your explanation of this process.
Some of the other items that we had indicated that were kind of notable cost increases that I think bear importance is our increase in our workman's comp rate, which resulted in quite a bit of a jump in workman's comp insurance that we have to carry for our workforce. The other piece was on our sewer utility billing, and we've gotten that down from what it was originally projected at about $90,000 to the city budget next year, down to about $50,000. And so that's going to hit the sewer utility piece. So it doesn't necessarily cover too much of the levy, but that's an item that we were able to, through some additional looking at that figure, get that down. And the other piece was on health insurance. And I think when on the surface, when someone read the newspaper article, they may have been questioning. So they made changes to their health insurance plan so they could hire more people. Well, let's clarify that as well. That we were projected this last summer with a 25% increase in our health insurance premiums over what our previous expenditure level was, which meant that we would have had to absorb an additional $700,000 of health insurance costs in 2014. But because we instituted some changes, some enhancements to the health insurance plan, we were able to stave off any increase. So our health insurance expenditure is actually flat for next year, which is kind of a nice situation compared to most businesses or governmental entities that have had major increases in their health insurance. And it's obviously something that's in headlines all across the country with the Affordable Care Act and others, but we were able to stave off any sort of sizable increase in that. So with that said, on the expense side of things, we had $1.1 million reduction in expenses. We were able to stave off some additional new spending in health insurance and some other areas. We had a number of retirements. Let's get into the hiring piece of things. As always, when a retirement happens, if the position has justification for refilling, it goes to the HR committee. There were a number of positions that we looked at, particularly in the street department through retirements this year, that we considered instituting a new program with limited term employees, LTEs. And essentially what those will allow us to do is be more flexible with employee work schedules. So as opposed to the traditional hire of a full-time year-round employee for certain tasks, we're able to now hire actually on a 2-to-1 basis employees for peak seasons, for example, in the summertime when the street department's in the heat of the season of construction. They've got the park department has their lawn mowing responsibilities, etc. So we're able to get, for the resident, more bang for their buck. So that program is going to be introduced this next year. So we're taking our seasonal, we'll have our regular seasonal labor force, which is that low skill kind of piece, and then we're going to have 2 variations of the LTE. So we're able to hire additional labor at the same cost from what we were previously accruing. So when you look at full-time equivalents in that calculation, that's a factor in there. The first full-time piece was the full-time ordinance control officer that I recognized in the previous first half of the show. Historically, that position has been made up of 3 people. It was a recycling officer and 2 part-time ordinance control officers, which frankly were students that were going to pursue their police science degrees and then became hired by different agencies, whether it was the city or the county or outside the area. So it was a revolving door, and I think residents fairly have said to us that our current ordinance control system is not working, and there's no consistency, there's no continuity if you've got people coming and going all the time. So the proposal that I proposed with some following conversations with some alderpersons is a full-time person with some consistency year in and year out could be a benefit. And then taking it a step further and saying if we're going to do enforcement to make sure our community looks good and there's some health and safety concerns are being met, that we're also pairing up some of those pieces with some financing, whether it's grant programs externally or other sources to make sure, maybe it's banks or something that would be willing to utilize maybe a low interest improvement loan or something, that we're taking that a step further, so we're being more effective on that respect.
Okay, so in other words, we're going to point out the problems, and then we're going to find a way to direct resources to solve those problems.
You got it. Yep, that's the plan. The second piece was a staff accountant, and we're projecting a number of retirements, and not necessarily any timeline on those, but at this point we don't have a lot of redundancy within the payroll process. So we want to make sure that we're with future planning purposes, and we're being good stewards of the taxpayer dollar, that we're funding a staff accountant position to deal with the payroll process and the redundancy there. But taking that piece a step further, we recognize that with finance, it's kind of a one-person show with dealing with departments besides the ones that perform payroll and bill-paying functions, that we need somebody to work alongside department heads to start developing metrics. So if we're going to introduce activity-based budgeting and really be successful at it, we need to make sure that somebody's working with those departments on a regular basis, because frankly, they're experts in their respective field. They're not experts in financing, and public finance is a whole nother ballgame anyways. So it's different than simply balancing a checkbook or something that they may have experience with. So that's the second piece, and again, we're projecting some retirements in the future that we hope that the one person then would replace one or more of those positions in the future.
Okay.
Third position was a GIS specialist, and that was budgeted actually last year. We just didn't fill it. This time around, we've made it a full-time position.
GIS, for the
right.
What does that stand for?
Geographic Information System. So
Okay.
It's taking all of our infrastructure data, our sewer lines, our water lines, and pulling that information out of file cabinets and getting it live. So if residents have been on, for example, the county's GIS, taking a look at parcel data, looking at the map that the county has, or tax bill information, that's an extension of this. It's just another application as opposed to mapping that type of information. We're now going to be mapping infrastructure assets.
Okay.
At the end of the day, we need to have a better handle on how old our assets are, and are we making the right investments annually? And then are we actually reconstructing the high priority items? Residents ask me, and I ask the same question of engineering and others, are we doing this street because it's the highest priority? And are there others that may be higher priority that we're not reconstructing or making investments in?
Or are there problems down the road that we don't even know about? And then all of a sudden it pops up and we got a blown sewer line somewhere and we got emergency expenditures.
Yeah, and while that position could be cutting edge to us, frankly, we are behind the times. The county's had a GIS specialist for 7 years, and the city of Marshfield has multiple people in their GIS area. We just need to get on the ball with this position, and this is something that we're hoping that Waterworks and Lighting will fund a third of the position. At this point, there's been conversations ongoing about whether they're going to fund up to or fund the third of the position, so hopefully they'll commit to the third.
Okay.
That's the other piece. And then we also did budget for a community development specialist. We're anticipating some reorganization with kind of the way we approach our park investments and park spaces, that bringing the residents along in that process, that engaging with them individually in the same way that Encourage has been able to engage with residents on the future of the Tribune building. It is our hope that we'd be able to use a similar process of our own to develop a plan for our park and public spaces. One of the criticisms I get is our parks and public spaces are not representative of a community that has a priority towards young families and young adults. And I think by putting our money where our mouth is in this respect, we'll better plan for our park investments in the future.
Okay. Bottom line, what are we looking at in terms of a tax rate? And is it going up or going down?
So our city tax rate will drop from $12.22 per thousand down to $11.50 or 51 cents if you round up per thousand. So back to the question, if you have a $100,000 house and your assessment went up $6,000, which was the average, your city taxes will go down about $2.05 based on that $100,000 home. There are other taxing entities, obviously. When you get your tax bill, pay attention to the numbers that are on there, and then that'll be a telling sign of who or why your taxes have gone up.
And then we have the tax cut that the legislature approved. How is that going to affect things?
We didn't account for that in here. I don't believe the state tax rate. So, that average $13 that you'll be able to go buy a couple things on the dollar menu or something at a fast food joint. I guess it's pretty exciting to those that are looking for that. That's a priority too. So I guess it'll be interesting to see how that it's reflected on those tax bills. But yeah, that's also out there.
And now that your second year doing this, do you feel you're getting a better handle on how the city spends its money, where it spends its money, and what do we need to do better going forward?
No question. I think the long and short of it for me is it's not only been a learning process, but it's also recognizing that we have a lot more to do. And I think when we talk about priorities and activity-based budgeting, the better we understand what activities we're performing, the better conversation we're going to be able to have with residents and with council members on whether or not this is a priority or not. You take the monthly brush pickup, for example. Last month we picked up 200 piles of brush around the city. We have 8,500 parcels, so one would say that it's not a high take rate of our residents. It's valuable to those that had brush out, right? No question. But to the rest of the taxpayers, does it make sense to keep funding that activity? I'm not proposing anything specifically to that, but that's a real life example of the conversations that I think our city needs to have going forward.
And with the brush pickup and us being a tree city, when you have stormy weather, you can have times when you have a whole bunch and you're going to need to do.
That's right. So there's a predictability factor that maybe you don't schedule and have a regular pickup, but you always make that service available following storms, which I don't think any municipality doesn't do, frankly.
Okay. But I guess the bottom line is this, when you're hearing about, the city's hiring all these people, subtract retirees, and with the retirees and what you're doing, it comes out to pretty flat employment at about 0.5%, and part of that is to the use of limited term employees.
Right, exactly. Yep.
Okay. Well, and now what's the process for the budget as people want to?
Yep, great question. So we'll be approving the budget on November 18th. So that's going to be our public hearing, and I encourage residents to appear at that time. They'll have their opportunity to speak to the council. It is a pretty late in the game change type of thing that are really the purpose of that meeting is to adopt the levy. What's the tax rate, the levy amount going to be? If there's questions about priorities, obviously that conversation's ongoing. We don't start and stop that with the budget process. So as we move into the year, some of the hires will also be discussed at the HR committee at the November and December council meeting, or at their committee meetings. So those will also be coming in front of the council in the future. But the tax levy and the tax rate will be approved at November 18th. It's a Monday. They're moving the council meeting based on couldn't get a quorum of council members to be at the Tuesday meeting. It's a hard time of the year for people with vacations and other priorities.
Okay. Well, sir, I thank you for a very informative program. We've learned a lot today, and we thank you for the effort. And we'll talk to you next month.
Okay.
Wisconsin Rapids Mayor Zach Vruwink wrapping up today's edition of the Morning Magazine, which has been brought to you by Riverview Medical Center. With you, it's personal and Comfort Air. CBS News is next.